Hi everyone! This is a summary on Chapter 8, Avoidance, in Coercion and Its Fallout by Murray Sidman. My name is Amanda Cahow. So negative reinforcement, there are two types. There's escape and avoidance. Last week we discussed escape, and this week is about avoidance. So in the introduction, Sidman talks about when we're punished, we do what we can to get away from that stimulus. And if we cannot escape the punishment, then we might resort to avoiding it entirely. So why wait to be shocked, then escape, if we could just avoid the shock overall? In the first section, An Ounce of Prevention, Sidman gives some examples of avoiding. So children might run from their parents in fear of being punished. Drivers fill up their gas tank to avoid running out of gas, and humans build dams to avoid floods. Our behavior is negatively reinforced by the notion that we are preventing something else from happening rather than avoiding the original stimulus. So there is a difference between escaping and avoiding. Escaping is a bad situation happens and we get away from it. Avoiding keeps the bad situation from ever happening. Avoiding makes escaping unnecessary. And again, avoidance is the second form of negative reinforcement. And coercion can lead to both escaping and avoiding. Avoiding is acting ahead of time, and it seems to have this future orientation, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Avoidance is a type of escape behavior, though, and lab studies have shown that rats avoid future shocks after previously escaping from prior shocks. So the next section, the causes of avoidance, Sidman discusses a lab study where there's dim light shined into a rat's cage. The rat has 5 seconds to press a lever to turn off the light, or else it gets shocked. So this light becomes a warning signal. The press of the lever equals the rat avoids the shock. So it takes longer time to learn how to keep the shock away rather than to turn the shock off. So the light turns on, the rat doesn't press the lever, the shock is applied after 5 seconds. Well, the rat presses the lever to stop the shock. After many trials, then the rats learn to press the lever as soon as the light signal turns on to keep away the shock entirely. So once the rat learns that pressing the lever prevents shock, it will be more experienced and most likely press the lever to avoid the shock entirely. People behave the same. Escape and avoidance are both generalized across species. Avoidance may be adaptive, but it has a negative side too. Others punish us and we punish others. Those who punish us become conditioned warning signals. We see those signals and avoid the stimulus. Avoidance is more adaptive than escape because wouldn't you avoid a shock from the start, or would you rather get shocked and then have to stop it? So back to this futuristic orientation. So avoidance appears anticipatory and controlled by a future event. If asked why the lever was pressed, a likely response would be to keep the shocks away. So the next section, Sidman questions this future shock. So he says the first cause of avoidance does not lie in the future, but in the past. We avoid shocks that have already happened to us. And the second cause of avoidance, he says, is in the present. We press the lever now because it leads to us getting fewer shocks in the current moment. So the causes of our behavior are both from what has happened to us in the past and what is happening to us in the now. So based on our previous experiences with positive and negative reinforcement, we might be more likely to avoid a certain situation. So pressing the lever to make shocks occur less is a form of escape, but simply saying we are trying to avoid future shocks is not a sufficient explanation. We really are pressing the lever because experience has taught us that pressing the lever is how we succeed in making shocks come less often, and this was a quote on page 126. Even though there are future consequences to pressing the lever, we had experience with shock or punishment in the past and the present. With coercion, avoidance is inevitable. A young child who refuses to go to school each morning and then is absent from school even after leaving the house may be avoiding being bullied and humiliated at school. We see what happens in the current, the avoidance, and might need to look more into the past events. Otherwise, the child might simply look suspicious for avoiding school. So when dealing with personal or someone else's coercion-induced avoidance by beginning therapy, defending ourselves, or learning to adapt, we need to do the following or we will remain helpless. We need to recognize that there is a problem behavior of avoidance, and then examine the past and present contingencies that might be reinforcing this avoidance. It is sometimes difficult to identify these contingencies, and when combined with futuristic orientation, this created myths about avoidance. So Sidman discusses two myths, expectancies as causes and fear and anxiety as causes. So Sidman discusses how expectancy brings seeming future control back to the present. So we attribute pressing the lever to the reduction in our present expectation of the shocks. Behavior analysis focuses on the actions in the past and the present rather than the future. To lessen a child's pain and discomfort at a doctor's office, the child would need to experience a doctor's visit without pain and discomfort. So we cannot reduce expectations without changing experience. But the overall myth that was debunked is the expectancy of a punishment does not cause avoidance. And the second one, fear and anxiety as causes. Sidman discusses how many psychologists and psychiatrists attribute internal causes to avoidance and those internal feelings of fear and anxiety. So we're avoiding those future events to escape our states of fear and anxiety. And he says that feelings should not have a priority over the external contingencies because feelings and emotions are triggered by the same event that did produce the avoidance. So if the fear and anxiety and avoidance are all caused by one event, then the feelings and emotion cannot explain the avoidance on their own. So Sidman discusses an example with having severe depression and suffering. There is an avoidance of contact with the environment, so they're just avoiding any sort of stimulus that might cause them fear or anxiety. And then living in this constant state of anxiety affects our body as a whole, but people typically ascribe misery to just those feelings of fear and anxiety. So this internal suffering may lead to therapy, which can result in psychiatrists prescribing medications, and these medications might just mask the unwanted feelings rather than actually identifying the shocks and the reinforcers that continued the depressive behavior. So avoidance is not always bad because it can be useful. There are survival situations like children learn not to touch hot stoves or step out into the street when cars are coming and not get into a car with strangers. And I liked this quote on page 130 that Sidman says, "Useful avoidance has led to the notion of useful anxiety and the realization that anxiety is not always to be eliminated." In a positive psychology course I took in undergrad, we discussed how stress can actually be a positive thing, and obviously not in all situations, but the psychological aspect of, or the physiological aspects, of stress and excitedness, they're very similar. So that stress does not always have to be bad. But the overall myth that was debunked is fear and anxiety does not cause avoidance. So lastly, Sidman discusses how sometimes we avoid without warning signals, and we're not always warned before being punished. So in a lab study with lever and shocks again, the shocks were administered every 20 seconds. There was no signal for the shock, but pressing the lever did delay the shock. So this was an adaptive behavior. The subjects learned that pressing the lever postponed the shock and decreased the total frequency. And an example was with monkeys. They learned that pressing the lever enough would get them multiple days at a time without a shock. So rarely do we see the immediate results of someone else's avoidance behavior. We can only guess why the animal presses the lever when there is a signal. With unsignaled, how the subject behaves is considered unrelated to anything else. So coercion is not always apparent in the lab, and this can attribute to coercion being unnoticed in our daily lives. So my questions are, what experiences do you or someone you know have with avoidance? And have you ever attributed one of those myths to your or someone else's avoidance behavior? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.